Jujutsu Kaisen's world is merciless. It spares nobody from any sorts of tragedies that they may undergo, as seen in the many different characters among the narrative. Especially how the story manages to use jutsu to further explore different sides of it with the cast, and how it greatly affects their lives for the better or worse. Whether it be Suguru Geto and his gradual descent into deciding that non-sources must be eradicated to bring balance to the human food chain, Toji Fushiguro's story and how he was cast aside due to his complete lack of cursed energy, and many alike. Satoru Gojo is no exception. A man whose name alone would instill terror among the masses of sorcerers, the one who's so overwhelmingly at the top as the strongest, yet so isolated. One of the story's main themes is the concept of strength and power and just how lonely it can be being the strongest. We see this tackled in various ways with Gojo, as well as how it affects other characters in the series. Or we even see a different side to the idea in Sukuna. We will be diving into manga spoilers all the way up to chapter 262 in this video, so please take note of that when watching. One quick look at Gojo as a character, and it's fairly obvious noticing his loneliness when it comes to his strength. And the story explores this in a multitude of ways. For instance, take his two most iconic abilities, Immeasurable Void and the Limitless technique. Immeasurable Void feeds an unlimited amount of information to its opponent, thereby rendering them useless due to the surge of information that flows into their brain. It's akin to Gojo's inability to do anything for Geto in Hidden Inventory. He had everything in strength and capability, but that in of itself rendered him useless when it came to saving his best friend from going astray, as well as trying to protect Amanai. It's more supported in that Gojo learns at the end of the arc that strength alone is not enough and that he's unable to save those who don't wish to be saved, so there's nothing that Gojo can do about it. And as for Limitless, it gradually slows down anything that goes near Gojo the closer they get to him infinitely. No matter how close you try getting to Gojo, you will never be able to reach him. It's no coincidence that he perfects this technique once he is enlightened after his fight against Toji, thereby truly ascending into greater heights as the strongest, straying further away from Geto. Gojo's conversation with Megumi here explores Gojo's view on how scarily lonely it can be being a sorcerer. Gojo sees that Megumi is unable to bring his best out and tends to be quite self-sacrificial. And Gojo tells him that Jujutsu sorcery is an individual sport, and no matter how many people you coordinate with, you will always die alone. To Gojo, he wants Megumi to give it his all and get stronger, rather than depend on trying to summon Mahoraga literally any chance he gets. It touches more on Gojo's philosophy on strength and how Gojo views the world. Gojo is essentially telling Megumi that it is perfectly fine to go all out and be selfish, because it's exactly how Gojo is like in his battles throughout the story, especially against Toji. Lose yourself in the heat of the battle, forget all the worries around you, and go wild. So I think this scene perfectly reflects this aspect of Gojo, as well as what he was like. This isn't to say that Gojo is telling Megumi to not care about anything, rather it's more about how he could get stronger. Moreover, this is an interpretation of mine, but I do get the impression that Gojo's carefree and nonchalant attitude that he has after the events of Hidden Inventory is sort of the way to lighten the mood up and not lose himself in his loneliness, and potentially just interact with others and have a good time with them, such as his students and whatnot. He wasn't exactly like this in Hidden Inventory, as he was much more blunt, rude, and egotistical. So I like to imagine that he started acting this way a bit after the arc. I think these two moments really hammer down Gojo's loneliness, and it's thanks to Yuta. He doesn't want Gojo to be so isolated and taken for granted anymore. For the longest, Gojo has always been the monster for everyone's sake, the one that takes care of everything for everyone. I mean, look at what Nanami says in Hidden Inventory about why not just have Gojo take care of everything from now on. He's the strongest, so where's the issue? There's also the fact that Gojo has never been understood, even sometimes misunderstood by his peers, such as the dreamlike sequence in chapter 236. The only thing people associate the man that is Satoru Gojo with is that he is the strongest, and it is disheartening. Yuta himself might not fully know all this, but he knows that they must have having Gojo do everything, and Yuta is willing to go as far as take that mantle himself, and he does so by copying Kenjaku's technique in order to use Gojo's body in a desperate attempt to defeat Sukuna. It's a terrible fate for Gojo, as not only does it highlight the idea that no matter what happens, Gojo's identity will always be used as a tool for Jujutsu, but it will also finally answer Geto's question. Is his strength solely tied to his identity as Satoru Gojo, or is his identity what makes him the strongest? After the events of Hidden Inventory, Gojo forms more of a goal in mind when it comes to jutsu, as opposed to his original viewpoint of not being concerned with the weak, and is only interested in the strong. And it's why one of Gojo's main goals in the story is to train the next generation so that they can combat whatever adversaries they may have to face when Gojo isn't around anymore. On top of this, Gojo is very caring when it comes to making sure these kids are also enjoying their youth, and not having it ripped away from them. It's very evident in how adamant he is when it comes to Yuta or Yuji's execution. It isn't just for the sake of training them for their potential in the case of Yuta. No matter who they are, they deserve to live their youth. And I think this does speak on Gojo's morality. He isn't one to kill somebody just because there's a chance that they might be dangerous, because he believes that Yuta and Yuji themselves are not bad people. Rather, it's their circumstances with Rika and Sukuna respectively that causes havoc. So he wouldn't stand in having them die just because of their circumstances, and instead train them into controlling their strength and using it properly. Another point is Gojo's distaste in how the jutsu world is ran. We don't see much of it, but it seems like they hold almost no concern for the likes of Yuji nor Yuta, and only go about things by the book, and only really use jutsu for their own self-interest. However, Gojo doesn't want to massacre them because somebody even worse would eventually just end up being in charge. It's ironic, because Gojo was willing to massacre a bunch of people after what happened to Amanai back in Hidden Inventory, and wasn't concerned about whether or not there was a reason for it. But here, he tries doing things properly, which is education and training these students into perhaps finding a successor in Yuta. It's why Gojo wasn't stressing out about his ceiling in Shibuya. He had faith in his students and knew that they'll somehow make it out of this whole ordeal. Throughout the events of Jujutsu Kaisen, whenever most of the characters, whether it be the antagonists or other members of the cast, speak about Gojo, it is usually referring to his identity as the strongest. Jogo fights him early into the series because he's been told how strong Gojo is. Barriers are made solely for the sake of preventing Gojo from entering the battle, as well as the plan to seal Gojo in Shibuya. Mekamaru even emphasizes on the fact that Kenjaku and the other curses can't move the prison realm because he's Satoru Gojo. Hell, take these sorcerers and how they're terrified of Gojo's presence because of how overwhelming he feels to everyone. But it never is about Satoru Gojo himself. Gojo is definitely aware of this, and to me, I get the idea that rather than submerging himself in the struggles and loneliness that this ensues, he tries to embrace it as this is the only thing he has going for him. If he wasn't the strongest, then nobody would pay any attention to him. It's why Gojo acts the way he does in the present. He loves taunting his enemies for being weak, such as Jogo, as well as mentioning himself as the strongest when need be. I think this is evident in chapter 236, where Gojo speaks about his strength that comes with isolation, therefore his only means of satisfaction and a sense of fulfillment being engrossing himself in the fights with all he's got. The title of the strongest is a chain that shackles him. And so this is where we introduce a character who presents some interesting insights into this aspect of Gojo, as well as being a direct contrast to him. Meet Toji Fushiguro, the Sorcerer Killer. The two almost never interact with one another, but I think there is so much to dissect from their dynamic. One of the biggest factors to discuss is how these two are complete opposites with one another. While Gojo's existence is infamous among sorcerers, Toji is literally invisible. He has no cursed energy and was cast aside by the Zenin clan as a failure due to this. Yet, it's that invisibility that makes him such a scary opponent to face against, considering he has such an immense amount of physical prowess to make up for it. To me, I think Toji's goal was to prove his existence to the world, to prove everybody wrong by destroying everything that is Jujutsu itself by crushing the strongest of them all, Satoru Gojo. It's why he taunts Geto for losing to a monkey like him, who has no cursed energy yet managed to demolish some of the most talented sorcerers out there. And I think Gojo feels the same in a way. I just talked about how I get the idea that Gojo may embrace this strength because it's the only thing that people think of him, and it's precisely that makes their battle so intriguing. It's a battle of identities. One is trying to prove his existence to the world by crushing the exact thing that rejected him for self-affirmation, and the other is trying to keep that identity upheld as much as he can. I think this iconic quote does encapsulate a lot when it comes to Gojo's desire to uphold his title as the strongest. At this moment, everything feels right to him, and nothing else could matter more. Not even the death of someone he cares about. He's the strongest, he's enlightened, and he was finally able to use reversed curse technique, and he's even floating around and flying all over the place, representing how much higher he is compared to everybody. In that moment, he truly was the honored one, and nothing could stop that. Toji's iconic pose does support this concept to me. Rather than be in the sky, he is at the bottom. Yet despite that, he's able to crush all those who's above him with nothing but his insane physical strength. And I think there's something poetic about how, in a way, Toji is shackled to being a puppet filled with nothing but an innate desire to chase after the strongest in this arc. If there's one character who could be labeled as Gojo's soulmate, it'd be Suguru Geto, Gojo's best friend. He's one of the few characters in the entire series who uses a first name basis with Gojo, and throughout Hidden Inventory, you can really see how close these two are and how well they really trust one another. What makes this relationship work so well is how, in a way, they essentially develop into one another. What was once Gojo's beliefs became Geto's, and vice versa. If you look at the way Gojo acts in Hidden Inventory, you'll see that he is a very angsty, arrogant, rash, and rude teenager. He holds no concern for the people he deems weak, and the only thing that matters is whether or not you're strong. I mean, our first introduction of him in this arc is taunting Utahime for being weak, while telling Mei that she wouldn't cry because she's strong. He's not interested in responsibilities nor ideologies when it comes to jutsu, as well as loathing the idea of being righteous. It works because it's realistic in a way. Gojo is just a teenager, and if they're granted so much talent this way without them being told not to brag and look down on others due to it, they'd very likely turn out to be so cocky and disrespectful towards others the way Gojo is. So it's no wonder he would turn out to be this way. Now if we look at Geto, he's the complete opposite. Unlike Gojo, he believes that there has to be a point and meaning for anything one does. For instance, his belief in Jujutsu is that it exists to solely protect the weak. He's much more by the book and desires to make sure things are kept in check and civil for society. Similarly, Geto does categorize people as weak and strong just like Gojo, but the difference is that he does not look down on them and wants to protect them, whether or not it be out of pity. Geto acts as the moral compass for Gojo in this arc. He's usually the one telling Gojo what to do and how to behave in certain situations, as Geto is the one to tell Gojo to be more polite and more conscious of the way he speaks. I really like that Gojo and Geto both see themselves as the strongest. I think it's a cool way to highlight that Geto is the one person Gojo lumps himself with as the title of the strongest, and the person he trusts most. Everything goes south when they're tasked with the goal of guarding Riko Amanai, the Star Plasma vessel, until she's able to merge with Tengen. Throughout the arc, both of them slowly shift into the other's ideals. Gojo gradually becomes less rude and starts becoming more compassionate, especially towards Amanai. Initially being reluctant to the idea of guarding her, he starts to grow subtly because of her despite her being someone Gojo would normally consider weak. We don't see much of it, but he does go out of his way to risk sightseeing in Okinawa just so she would enjoy some of her last remaining days before the merger. And to add on, both Gojo and Geto agreed before the mission began that if Amanai were to refuse the merger, they would call it off immediately. I also think another way of looking at this aspect of Gojo is that perhaps rather than him growing to be more compassionate and caring, it was always there. It's just that his arrogance and condescending nature was a byproduct of his overwhelming strength. And from what I mentioned earlier on the possibility that Gojo flaunted his strength due to his identity being strictly tied to it, it could be an explanation for this, though I'd lean more on the former interpretation. The scene where Gojo is tempted to massacre the entire religious group over what happened to Amanai really emphasizes the switch in roles between him and Geto. Had Geto not been there for Gojo, things would have changed drastically. Perhaps Gojo may have formed similar beliefs to the Geto we know of today, and potentially just resort to murdering the weak for how they go about things, such as how he witnessed Amanai's death. But it was Geto that prevented him from doing this because it would be pointless. There was no reason for it.
すぐる、こいつら殺すか？今の俺なら多分何も感じない。いい。意味がない。意味ね。それ、本当に必要か？大事なことだ。特に、術師にはな。
But Gojo can't comprehend the mentality here anymore, and wonders if there really needs to be a point to things at this point. This scene is a huge stepping stone to their change. As Gojo is enlightened and manages to make the limitless technique automatic, Geto is left behind. In the same light, Gojo is left behind as well. As his one and only best friend, his moral compass leaves him behind to pursue another path that strays away from Gojo. Gojo lost the one person he would lump in with himself as the strongest, and they were no longer the strongest together. It was just Gojo by himself, and Gojo is distraught by this. Even up to the current events of the story, Gojo wants to catch up to Geto, and to do this, he feels as though he must become the monster for everybody all on his own. Geto is left behind due to Gojo's immense strength, while Gojo is left behind due to Geto's gradual descent into madness, and losing the one person who saw him for who he is as Satoru Gojo. Amanai's death affected Geto most. The clapping sounds haunted him, making him shake his core beliefs whether or not they really were right, and if these people were worth protecting. It doesn't help when he sees others such as the little girls that were discriminated against he meets in the village. They were treated like garbage and monsters just from being able to see curses. So are they really worth protecting? This is actually the one thing to don't shift in terms of development though. While Gojo manages to find the reason for using Jujutsu in prospering the next generation education, Geto still sticks to his core principle in doing things as long as there's a reason for it. We see this in their last confrontation, a hidden inventory. It's ironic. Geto prevents Gojo from going rogue, yet Gojo is the reason Geto goes rogue in the first place due to feeling left behind, on top of the haunting thoughts he's had over Amanai's death. After all, Amanai died a pointless death, considering even without the merger, Tengen is fine. This all extends throughout Jujutsu Kaisen 0 as well. We can see that Geto doesn't actually force people into his beliefs as shown in the two girls and the others that are part of his family. They follow him because they envision Geto's world. It's interesting because you'd usually think these kind of characters would resort to peer pressure and forcing everyone around them to share the same views, but Geto treats Sorcerer fairly normally, and you can argue that he may treat them better than Gojo does, considering Gojo literally threw Inumaki and Panda into the fight just so they'd get injured to awaken Yuta. Here, Geto holds beliefs that Gojo once had in the past. He looked down on the weak as nothing but monkeys, and their existence being solely tied to roles that exist to prop up the strong, because to him it's ridiculous that the weak can suppress the strong with sheer numbers. I really like how at the end of it all, Geto's first concern when seeing Gojo in Jujutsu Kaisen 0 is whether or not his family was safe. It really does show that despite how badly Geto has shaped up due to the defense of hidden inventory, he still does treat sorcerers with care, and it's shown in how he also is willing to let them do what they want, such as the scene of the two girls wanting to go to a crepe shop. He's been a lot more carefree as opposed to his composed self in hidden inventory, and acts a bit closer to how Gojo is like in mannerisms such as provoking others just as how Gojo does with the Kyoto principle. What I love most about the final scene in Jujutsu Kaisen 0 is that in the end, Gojo still trusts Geto despite everything that's happened. Geto is quite possibly the only person that may have understood Gojo at the time and treats him as a human, and not as an identity as the strongest. And I think that Gojo deep down can't bring himself to completely break the connection to Geto. He even uses it to his advantage as he knew that Geto would never kill Inumaki and Panda because they're young sorcerers and it contradict everything Geto stands for. And to tie everything all together, while Gojo's death was a satisfactory one to him, fighting against the King of Curses and giving his all in an attempt to be fully understood with a smile on his face as shown in this panel, Geto never found solace and happiness, and was always miserable after going on this path. When it comes to Gojo and Sukuna, they're actually quite similar in a lot of things. Sukuna is essentially what you can envision as a different version of Gojo. A Gojo who wasn't concerned with his loneliness and pure lived for himself and the thrill of battle. You can also argue that this could be what Gojo may have turned into had Geto not been there for him when he was about to massacre their religious group in hidden inventory. Sukuna at his core is driven by freedom and strength. He isn't interested in any identities, future, past, or anything alike, and it is shown in his scene with Jogo. Sukuna finds companionship and grouping together to be the cause of weakness, and that he isn't interested in whether or not others understand him. To truly be strong, one must cast aside all qualms about everything and focus your being into becoming the strongest there is, while crushing everything else to the ground. This aspect of their dynamic isn't simply a contrast, and there's a bit more to it to discuss. It's been previously said about Gojo that grouping with him does indeed cause him to be weaker, because he is held back when somebody else is with him. And during Gojo's conversation with Megumi all the way back to Origin of Obedience, even Gojo himself does find coordination to not be all too helpful, as even at the end of it all, you'll just die alone regardless. It's interesting because in a way, they both do hold similar ideology when it comes to strength, but there's obviously a very defining difference, and it's Gojo is concerned about his loneliness. Sukuna's ideologies are shown and established from the second he's on screen. The moment he's summoned, he roams around freely, indulging himself in whatever things he finds amusing, whether it be destruction, ensuing chaos in Shibuya, or entertaining himself with the sorcerers of whatever era he's in. He holds the strong in very high regard because to him, that's the only thing that matters. It's why we have the stand proud scene, and even in the scene where he asks Yuji why he's so weak, looking down at him and not comprehending the point of clinging on to life despite being this way. To Sukuna, being weak is just as good as not being alive. What makes things more compelling is that he understands the pain and struggles of these humans, it's just that he couldn't care less about them. We see this in how he understands what makes Gojo and Kashimo so lonely. Many sorcerers have fought Sukuna in order to be recognized and valued for their worth, to be loved, and Sukuna knows this. He believes that the strong are loved for their strength, which in the grand scheme of things, when you take Gojo's story into consideration, and for Sukuna to act the way he does is his response to that love. Must strength be so lonely? Must it be a cursed fate of endless searching for stronger adversaries to quell an unbounded thirst? To Sukuna, affection is worthless. He does not need anybody to satisfy him. He does whatever, whenever. He eats whenever, whatever. And in his eyes, humans are refreshing because each one has their own unique taste to them during battle. But all it is a time killer until death. Which brings us to the scene of Sukuna losing himself in thought after seeing Yuji using reverse curse technique to heal himself. Sukuna has never held any ideals. He simply lives in the present. He loves the thrill of battle and loves to entertain himself until he's satisfied. Yet, he is irritated over the idea that Yuji's conviction and ideals are unbreakable. Perhaps the many sorcerer's final words he's heard were either lies or buttering themselves up. But because Sukuna has been a part of Yuji all this time, he knows that this is no lie. Yuji will not back down unless Sukuna is defeated. With all this established, there are other things that the two share. For instance, they both don't really care what happens to their corpses after death, and it says a lot about both of them. After death, their identities and strengths are no more. If they're dead, then that means they are no longer the strongest. To Gojo, it means he is nothing, as the only thing people speak of when it comes to him is his strength. So death means that he no longer holds that title, and in a way, he'll be free. To Sukuna, death means that he is no longer the strongest as well, and therefore he is weak. He might as well be an ant in his eyes, and it's exactly why he pities others such as Yuji when he deems him as a weakling. And I feel as though he'd see his death in the same way. While Sukuna's strength makes him free, Gojo's strength is what shackles him from that freedom, and it's why the climactic fight between the two is so important to both characters. The fight itself is a conversation between the strongest of this era and the strongest in history, one where Gojo is giving his all to convey everything he has to Sukuna because he understands his solitude more than anyone else. And it makes sense. Of all the people to recognize and sympathize with Sukuna's solitude, it'd have to be Gojo, considering the magnitude of Gojo's loneliness is just as much as Sukuna's. Kashimo says it himself. Interrupting this fight would be wrong, because this fight is for Gojo's sake. Throughout the fight, it's clear that the two are engrossed into the fight like nothing else matters. They are the only people in this world at this very moment. It's unlike the Toji fight where it's a battle of identities and existences. Here, it's a conversation that encapsulates everything that is Satoru Gojo. From his techniques that he's gained over the years, from the skills that he's rated into this body of his, and so much more. It's a battle to determine who truly holds the title of the strongest, and in a tragic sense, Gojo might have found the person who possibly may be the only one out there that can truly understand him. Maybe even more than Geto or Yuta. Geto may have understood and treated Gojo as a human and not as the strongest, but he could never relate to the absurd power that Gojo was gifted with. Sukuna is the only one who is isolated, but is also on par with Gojo's strength, and I really love that. It's a unique and fantastic way to incorporate a character's strength into their characterization, and here it's shown in full view. I think it's also worth noting that there's something interesting that Sukuna did have someone who saw through his loneliness. Although somebody who, unlike Geto, was obsessed with Sukuna and wanted his solo to evolve for themselves, Yorozu. I think Yorozu is an interesting contrast to the way Geto and Gojo's dynamic is structured. She's more of a stalker and wants to make Sukuna completely hers by making sure she's the one who teaches him about love, strength, and its loneliness. She's completely insane and selfish. She may have seen through Sukuna's loneliness, but she doesn't understand what makes Sukuna, Sukuna. The dreamlike sequence in chapter 236 captures everything that this dynamic is about, while also perfectly encapsulating who Satoru Gojo is as a person. It's ironic that, despite the fact that Gojo tells Megumi that sorcerers always die alone, he's surrounded by the many people he's known to care for over the years, such as Nanami, Geto, and Haibara. It serves to show that Gojo is not as lonely as he once was, as he says it himself right here. It's just that no matter what, people will never be able to understand him. You can admire a flower and grow it, but you can never tell it to understand you. He may be the only person in this world who can sympathize and understand Sukuna's solitude. After all, Gojo can relate to this, and we've seen it time and time again. Throughout the entire series, every character has admired, idolized, or is scared of Gojo due to his title, and almost feels like at times he's treated as a weapon rather than a person. But no matter how much they cared for or admired him, they were never able to fully comprehend who Satoru Gojo was as a person. And it's tragic. It was only Sukuna, the king of curses, who was able to comprehend the man's strength and loneliness after duking it out with such a grandiose battle. Gojo may have not been able to push Sukuna to his limits, but I think he was definitely able to convey everything he wanted to tell Sukuna throughout this battle, and by proxy to be understood by him. Even in the dreamlike sequence, Nanami and the others don't really understand Gojo and just write him off as an egotistical, selfish sorcerer who is only interested in Jujutsu for himself and nothing else. While there's a part of Gojo who loves using jutsu for himself for the many reasons we discussed in this video regarding his dynamic with Toji and the idea of solitude and strength, Gojo definitely cares for people and is evident in many of his actions throughout the story. He wouldn't be educating the youth the way he does, nor would he put so much faith in them, such as the Shibuya incident. I think rather than the scene emphasizing that Gojo is uncaring, it is actually presenting the tragic reality that even in the end, nobody but Sukuna understood Gojo the most. And it's a perfect conclusion for a character such as Gojo, and I think that this is likely the case considering Gojo's expression when Nanami makes the point is a very annoyed and unpleasant expression. I think a perfect point to finish this video off is that amidst everything, the man known as Satoru Gojo was the first person in history to be respected by Sukuna in such a high degree, enough for Sukuna to have an expression such as this. It works perfectly to show that Sukuna just gets Gojo after all this, and it's an ironic conclusion when you consider the fact that the most abhorrent character in the series is the one who manages to comprehend him fully. There's something about Sukuna being capable of destroying the limitless technique and defeating Gojo by slicing the space that separates Gojo and everybody else. I think that in a way, this is a metaphor for Sukuna being the first to destroy all the walls and barriers around Gojo, and finally having someone be able to get close to him. And that was his defeat. And at the very end of everything, Satoru Gojo was happy.